Joe Budden versus Taxstone, the interview that changed podcasting.
I just asked you a question and you fucking talking. What are you talking about, man?
You're pretty interesting.
Yo, what's wrong with this dude, son?
Because I think you're interesting. I'm just saying, I think you're interesting.
Yo, what is wrong with this dude, son? Yo, what you talking about, son? It's crazy, son. Let's.
You good?
I'm asking a fucking question.
All right, that was tax season.
Therapist on me, son. Like, don't do that for me, son.
Joe Budden and Taxstone's solo podcast together remains a testament to the sliding doors that were Taxstone and Joe Budden. Both of these men were some of the biggest pillars of urban podcasting. Taxstone was the pioneer, but Joe Budden would master the art form. And when these two clash, boy, was it great. I mean, you had two great manipulators, and each one was trying to outclass the other in a manipulation showdown. I urge everyone to watch this interview, as it has aged like fine wine. And I must say, I have to give it to Taxstone, as while many people think he's some type of bull in a china shop who doesn't know what he's talking about or he's like slow, he was actually very intelligent and witty enough to go toe-to-toe with Joe Budden, the semantics god. Now what we're going to do is take a look back at this episode and talk about some of the ramifications that occurred from the show. This whole thing starts off with Taxstone introducing this theory that Joe Budden has just mastered the internet. And that's an astute observation by Taxstone, as Joe Budden is great at playing into the internet, and he is a master of it. Then Joe talks about how forthcoming and visible he is, and that's why he's always criticized. After that, they get into a little bit of small talk about Joe's time in the industry, but things really start to get a little interesting when Joe is asked by Taxstone about his start in the podcast space. And Tax asks why Joe didn't come to loudspeakers. Now this is very fascinating because it kind of outlines how Joe was always a independent thinker and did not seek to sign with a network even back then. Then their wires start to get crossed early on in the interview when Taxstone asks about Meek Mill versus Joe Budden and asks Joe Budden if he could beat Meek Mill in a battle. And Joe doesn't say yes, instead saying, I don't think there's many people that could beat me in a battle.
You think you could beat Meek Mill in a battle?
I don't think there's very many people that could beat me in a battle.
So you could beat Meek Mill in a battle.
My statement is exactly the same.
Correct.
What did he not understand about my answer?
And I believe at this point, a little bit into the interview, Joe Budden's semantics is starting to frustrate Taxstone. Then, funnily enough, they talk about a theoretical battle between Drake and Joe. And Joe is told by Tax that he cannot beat Drake. Interesting because Joe would eventually battle Drake. Then another semi-debate occurs between Tax and Joe when they start talking about the Joe vs. Hollow battle. And Joe refuses to acknowledge losing to Hollow. But Tax swears up and down that, you lost to Hollow, Joe. That's what Tax says. And even Joe is starting to get frustrated with Tax, saying that he needs to comprehend what he's saying.
I didn't say anything about battling. Now your comprehension, you got to follow what I'm saying.
And I think Joe starts playing a dangerous game here, kind of hinting that Tax can't keep up with him in terms of a mental showdown. And then Joe ratchets it up a level, calling Tax a surface level thinker.
On your own ship, and that's why you should have just stayed away from it.
Yeah, but I think your train of thought is very surface.
As far
It's very small in that regard.
They then get into a battle about Joe saying he did battle rap a favor by battling, and Joe tells Tax that's not what he said, and Tax fires back, essentially saying he isn't a star tender and he can't be manipulated by Joe with the words that he uses against some of those ladies that he used to date.
You have created a sentence and then begin to have conversations with yourself.
No, that's you. You can't.
No,
don't do that to me.
I'm just telling you.
I keep trying to tell you.
What's
I'm
happening.
not none of them in a third world country.
Then Joe calls out Tax, saying that he's talking to himself during an interview, and Tax fires back by saying once again he is not from a third world country like the star tenders he likes to talk to. After that, Joe tells Tax that his thinking is small-minded, and Tax cuts him off, and Joe says that if he keeps talking over him, he will no longer speak in the interview and be silent.
You just said.
Did you not go back and forth for ransom?
Wait, I can't talk over you. So if you're talking, I'll be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Then Joe does something interesting that's very similar to what he does on the podcast with his co-host. He says that they need to move on from the topic because it isn't interesting. This is kind of the same thing he tells Ish and Ice when he's getting into arguments with them. And Joe says that Tax is pushing his opinion on people. Joe then doubles down and says that Tax is talking about the Hollow battle for way too long, for about 30 minutes, and Tax accurately points out it wasn't a 30-minute conversation. So what you're seeing here is a ping pong battle, a battle of tennis, and it's beautiful to see if you go back and listen to it. Then they start talking about stacked bundles and couples therapy. It's kind of a tangent. Nothing really happens until a little bit later when Tax asks Joe how old Kaylin was.
Make that assessment at such a young, early age like that.
How old is she?
Kaylin is 23. She'll be
Why
24
took you so long
in
to-
November.
Why it took you so long?
Long to what?
To say her age?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
And man, Tax is starting to go nuclear here. Now, obviously, what Tax is hinting at is how young Kaylin Garcia was when she met Joe Budden. And it got real awkward because Joe was kind of delayed in answering it. And it was just really interesting because that's been a critique of Joe himself about, these women that he used to date being young. Tax then calls Joe a word semantic god. And Joe says back to Tax that it's hard to measure if Tax is being condescending or serious. Then Tax asks Joe if he likes black women because of his history with Latinas. He was trying to put Joe in a bad position. Obviously, Joe says that he loves black women and that Tax should not be judging his interests off of his public dating excursions. Then Joe reveals that Tax doesn't know him, so it's kind of odd that Tax is calling him a manipulator.
No, I could tell he's a manipulator.
Met.
I don't need to know him for 10 years to know that.
But Tax fires back, saying that since he is a manipulator, he knows one when he sees one. And then Joe does an interesting semantical tactic. He asks for 3 examples. But funny enough, Rory happens to be there and stands up for Joe against Tax. And
But
I think you're trying to have a block conversation with him, and he's not trying to have that.
No, it's not no block conversation.
it's quite honestly a funny sight to see Joe be defended by Rory, and Rory's essentially saying, hey man, Joe Budden is not a manipulator. I wonder if Rory would say that now. After that, Joe says he's not going to justify the stupid stuff coming out of Tax's mouth, and it starts getting a little bit heated. Then Taxstone mentions Joe's altercation with Wu-Tang and also introduces a line of questioning about his issues with Esther Baxter, and Joe kind of shuts down and says you would have to ask her. And it is at this point that Tax's patience is wearing thin. Joe then explains the disconnect and why Tax and him are having their wires crossed, and Tax gets frustrated and doubles down in saying Joe is a spin artist. Joe snaps, and Tax calls Joe a liar. And then Joe lays out how Tax has been conducting himself and how it's been off-putting to him during the interview. And then Tax snaps again and calls Joe special needs. After that, Tax asks Joe another question about his album, with Joe looking frustrated, and calls Tax interesting. And then Tax finally breaks down for the last time on the show, barks on Joe, and then Joe leaves the studio before things go left. Now, this is an interesting interview to look back at because Joe Budden will later on say that before this interview started, Taxstone brandished a firearm just to let him know he had a gun. And later on, when Taxstone would get arrested, Joe Budden and Taxstone would engage in a war of words, basically taking shots at each other. It seemed like Taxstone never got over this interview, and I think Tax just thought lowly of Joe this whole time, and I believe after this interview, Joe thought lowly of Tax as well. And these two men are interesting because Rory himself said that there was kind of like a competitive nature between the two pods.
There was this time when Taxstone was king, right, in podcasting. Was that ever a thing, like, between the two pods? There was a Taxstone versus the Joe Budden podcast with Rory Mal. There was this idea that y'all were competing. Shout out to Tax. He was one of the pioneers of this, by the way.
Definitely shout out to Tax.
That y'all were y'all actively competing, like, we gotta beat Tax?
I wouldn't say like a beef and wanting to beat Tax, but to say we didn't pay attention to what Tax was doing would be a lie. Like, I listened to it as a fan, but also as a peer and a competitor. Of course we wanted to beat Tax. Tax wanted to beat us. Why wouldn't you have that mentality? But it wasn't a Tax. Even that whole, like,
that'd be a bad idea.
Even when no, of course not. But we were all cool. Like,
Yep.
Despite that whole situation that went viral, like, even after that, everything was cool. Like, we saw Tax the night that he got arrested.
Wow.
And it was love. Like,
So there was a friendly competition. Okay.
yeah, absolutely. Friendly competition. Anything with Loudspeaker, though, at the time was friendly competition. And we met with Loudspeaker. They tried to sign us. Before there was any pod manager, I was taking every meeting with Reggie, and that was a conversation at one point. Not to say it was ever going to get there, but, it was a conversation.
So, you fast forward to now where Tax essentially has thrown away his chance to be the podcast king, and now Joe Budden sits on the throne of podcasting with his fellow competitors falling by the wayside. I mean, you have Charlemagne, who is now too politically correct to even give out the takes that would be engaging. You have Noriega, who has signed his podcast to a brand that is attached to Diddy and Revolt TV. And then you have $1 million worth of Game, who has compromised their integrity by taking ad after ad and ruining their listener experience. So I think it's important to look back at Tax and maybe realize that he was the only threat that ever existed to Joe Budden. But now that threat sits behind a wall. But let me know what you think about this interview. Did you listen to it? And if so, did you listen to it again? Because it's quite fascinating and quite interesting to go back and listen to a moment that was so special in the podcast game. All right, y'all. That's my video for this subject. Follow me on Instagram, The Stop TV. Follow me on Twitter, The Stop TV. I also saw somebody saying that, they do their best not to mention me, but they keep mentioning me on their Discord. They keep mentioning me on Twitter Spaces. They keep mentioning me in the interviews they do. It just ain't adding up. I think the facade is finally falling down. But a lot of Discord riders, a lot of Discord hoppers out there speaking. A lot of you losers were on my Discord. Only some people might know what I'm talking about, but you guys are so insignificant to me. You can't control your anger. Something hurt you in the past, so now you gotta cry like a little baby. Go to see a therapist. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Like I said, follow me on Twitter, The Stop TV. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.